The United States is the wealthiest, most militarily capable nation in history. Yet, for more than 100 years, after Christopher Columbus stumbled into the Caribbean, the major European powers completely ignored North America. When Spain and Portugal drew a line down the middle of the map to divide the world, the Spanish focused almost entirely on the southern half of the Americas. That is where millions of people and precious metals were already concentrated. They viewed the vast northern territories as largely useless. By the time the English finally decided to try building colonies, nearly a century later, they were left with a narrow, hostile strip of land along the Atlantic coast. Meanwhile, the French had been busy claiming the entire middle of the continent. Pinned between the ocean and a massive French empire, these isolated English settlements had no clear path to survival, let alone global dominance. Eventually, the British government realized their North American colonies had become expensive to defend. When Britain demanded the colonists pay heavy new taxes to cover those debts, without allowing them a vote in the matter, the dispute escalated into an outright revolution. But winning independence from Britain didn't automatically create a functional country. For 5 years, the 13 colonies operated as 13 separate nations, bound together entirely in name. The national government they created was an absolute mess, and the republic was failing fast. To prevent total collapse, political leaders drafted a brand new constitution to establish a functional federal system. In 1789, they elected George Washington as the first president to hold this precarious union together. The government was finally working, but the United States was still geographically tiny, heavily indebted, and entirely boxed in by aggressive European empires. To understand America's aggressive Western expansion, we have to look at raw demographics. This chart shows a geometric explosion in the American population, which was compounding and doubling every 20 years. The average family had 7 children, and all these people needed space to live and farm. The U.S. desperately needed Western access to the Mississippi River, which belonged to France. Across the Atlantic, Napoleon Bonaparte was preparing to invade Britain and needed cash fast. To fund his war, he agreed to sell the entire Louisiana Territory to the Americans for $15 million. Over a single transaction, the size of the United States doubled. A few years later, in 1819, the government negotiated another opportunistic deal, purchasing Florida from a weakening Spanish empire to solidify the southern border. The push westward eventually bypassed official borders entirely. The newly independent Mexican government invited Americans to settle its sparsely populated northern territory of Texas. Within a few years, American settlers outnumbered the Mexican residents, rebelled to form their own republic, and they ultimately convinced the United States to absorb them. Border disputes over Texas gave President James K. Polk the justification to provoke a war with Mexico. After defeating the Mexican army, the U.S. handed over another $15 million and stripped Mexico of its remaining northern territories, including California. Through rapid population growth, cash purchases, and military aggression, the United States transformed from a vulnerable coastal strip into a vast sea-to-sea continental fortress in exactly 50 years. Acquiring all this new land exposed a deep, unresolved fracture. The northern states had outlawed slavery and viewed it as a moral evil, while the southern agricultural economy relied on it completely. Every time a new territory was added, the argument over whether it would allow slavery threatened to tear the country apart. The decades of political compromise finally failed in 1860. With the election of Abraham Lincoln, southern states believed the federal government would soon abolish slavery entirely, prompting them to secede and form a confederacy. The resulting Civil War was brutal. It required 4 years of intense combat and a massive loss of American life to physically force the southern states back into the Union and legally abolish slavery. The conflict permanently settled the question of national sovereignty. The fractured, squabbling states were violently forged into a single, centralized industrial power, firmly in control of an entire continent. By the mid-19th century, the U.S. had reached the Pacific Ocean and ran out of contiguous borders to expand. To keep growing, they looked overseas. The earliest acquisitions were highly practical. Under the Guano Islands Act, the government began claiming remote, uninhabited ocean islands purely to harvest bird droppings for agricultural fertilizer. The appetite for territory quickly scaled back up. When the Russian Tsar needed money, Secretary of State William Seward negotiated the purchase of the enormous Alaskan territory for a mere $7 million. The expansion soon became overtly strategic. American businessmen had already staged a takeover of the Hawaiian Islands, and despite intense domestic debate over the morality of imperialism, the U.S. government officially annexed Hawaii to secure a critical deepwater naval base in the Pacific. These acquisitions signaled a transition from internal agrarian growth to a global strategy. By securing these outposts, the U.S. gained the infrastructure needed to protect international trade and project military force across both oceans. That military capability was tested in 1898. Cuba was fighting a war for independence against Spain, and when an American warship sank in a mysterious explosion in Havana Harbor, the U.S. had a perfect geopolitical excuse to intervene in Spain's colonial affairs. The U.S. demanded Spain leave Cuba, and Spain declared war in response. In a matter of months, the American military dismantled what was left of the Spanish Empire, taking direct control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. This aggressive foreign policy accelerated rapidly under President Theodore Roosevelt. When Colombia refused to sell the U.S. the rights to build a canal through its territory, Roosevelt simply supported a Panamanian independence movement and then bought the rights from the newly formed country of Panama. Completed in 1914, the Panama Canal instantly connected the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The massive U.S. Navy could now move its fleets between hemispheres in a matter of days, completely bypassing the grueling journey around South America. In 4 centuries, the ignored, goldless coastal colonies had successfully exploited global crises to secure a continental heartland and a 2-ocean navy. As the First World War began, the United States stood as a dominant industrial and naval power, capable of influencing events anywhere on the planet.